In the quiet village of Willowbrook, where the hills rolled gently into the horizon and the wind carried the scent of fresh earth, young Elias often found himself lingering by the old oak at the edge of the fields. He was 12, with eyes that caught every flutter of movement, and on this afternoon the sky opened wide above him. A flock of swallows wheeled and dipped in perfect unison, their wings slicing the air without effort. Elias stood still, his bare feet rooted in the grass, watching as they climbed higher and higher until they became dark specks against the blue. Something stirred inside him at that sight. The birds did not labor or stumble. They simply rose, as if the world had no hold on them. He had seen them before, of course, but today the rhythm of their flight settled into his chest like a new heartbeat. He tilted his head back, following one bird as it banked sharply and caught an updraft, gliding without a single beat of its wings. The village behind him faded, the distant chatter of his neighbors and the lowing of cattle all fading into nothing. Elias turned and walked back toward the cluster of cottages, but his mind stayed in the sky. At supper he ate without speaking, pushing peas around his plate while his mother talked of the harvest. When the lamps were lit and the house grew still, he slipped out the back door with a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal he had saved from the hearth. He found his way to the small shed behind the mill, where the miller kept old sacks and broken tools. No one came here at night. The door creaked once, then closed behind him. Inside, moonlight slipped through a crack in the roof. Elias knelt on the dirt floor and smoothed the paper across his knee. He drew a single line first, a long curve meant to suggest a wing, then another line beside it, mirroring the first. His hand moved faster as he added the shape of a body, thin and light, with a pointed nose like the swallows he had watched. He paused, studying the drawing, then added crossbars and a small tail at the end. It looked nothing like a real bird, yet the lines felt alive on the page. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it beneath a loose board in the floor. Tomorrow he would come again. The thought made his fingers itch. He imagined what it might feel like to leave the ground, to feel the wind push against something he had made. The village would still be there, the fields and the cottages and the river that wound past them, but he would be above it all, looking down on the rooftops and the smoke rising from chimneys. Over the next days, Elias returned to the shed whenever he could steal a moment. He drew more shapes, some with wide wings like the hawks that circled the pastures, others narrow and sleek like the swallows. He added small marks for ropes and frames, guessing at how they might hold together. His fingers grew black with charcoal, and he washed them in the river before going home so no one would ask questions. At night he lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and in his mind the drawings lifted off the paper and climbed into the dark. One evening a storm rolled in from the hills. Rain drummed on the shed roof while Elias worked by the light of a single candle. He drew a larger version this time, filling the whole sheet with lines that crossed and supported one another. He shaded the wings to show how they might catch the air, then added a tiny figure seated between them. The figure was only a few strokes, but it was enough to make him smile. When the rain eased, he hid the new drawing with the others and stepped outside. The air smelled clean and sharp. Far above, a single bird fought the last gusts, riding them toward the clearing sky. Elias walked home through the wet grass, the image of that bird and his own drawing still turning in his thoughts. The spark had taken hold, quiet but steady, and he carried it with him like a secret flame. Elias reached the old barn just as the last light faded from the sky. He pushed the heavy door aside and stepped into the familiar dimness, where dust motes drifted through the beams like slow thoughts. The spark from the bird and the drawing still warmed him. He set to work at once, pulling scraps of wood and cloth from the corners he had gathered over weeks. The first prototype took shape by lantern light. Elias bent thin strips of ash into a frame, stretched old bedsheet fabric across it, and tied everything with cord and wire. He worked through the night, measuring twice before cutting once, his hands steady even when his eyes grew heavy. By morning, the machine sat in the center of the barn floor, a clumsy thing with wide wings and a tail that looked almost right. He dragged it outside into the meadow behind the barn, where the grass lay flat from the rain. The launch was simple at first. Elias ran with the glider held high, feeling the wind tug at the cloth. For a few strides it lifted, the frame light in his grip. Then a gust caught the left wing too hard. The whole thing twisted, dipped, and slammed into the ground 10 paces ahead. Wood splintered, fabric tore. Elias stood panting, staring at the broken shape. He walked over, knelt, and turned each piece in his hands. The left strut had been too thin. The cord on the tail had slipped. He carried the wreckage back inside and laid the parts out in a line, studying how each had failed. Word spread quickly through the village. By the next afternoon, a few boys from the lane had climbed the fence to watch. They laughed when Elias carried out the second attempt, this one smaller and weighted with river stones for balance. He ignored them and ran again. This time the glider rose farther, almost to the height of a man, before the nose dipped without warning. It hit the ground nose first and cartwheeled once. The boys hooted and one shouted that Elias was wasting good kindling. He gathered the pieces without looking their way, though the words stung. Back in the barn, he spread the broken frame on the floor again. The stones had shifted mid-flight. The fabric had caught too much air at the front. He sketched the mistakes on a scrap of paper, noting the angle of each break. Days passed in the same rhythm. Elias built a third version, lighter this time, with the wings cambered like the birds. He tested it alone at dusk when the meadow was empty. The glider left his hands cleanly and sailed a dozen paces before a sudden downdraft folded the right wing. It landed in a heap. He repaired what he could and tried once more the following morning. The fourth attempt climbed higher than any before, caught a steady breeze, and glided almost to the far fence. Then a gust from the trees flipped it sideways. It crashed hard enough to split the main spar. Elias stood over the ruin, breathing through the ache in his chest. He did not kick the pieces or shout. Instead, he collected every fragment and brought them inside, arranging them exactly as they had landed. The ridicule grew louder after that. Farmers passing on the road called out that the boy was chasing clouds. One evening, 2 older lads from the village stopped by the fence and offered mock advice about sticking to plows and horses. Elias answered with a nod and kept sanding a new strut. Their laughter faded when he did not rise to it. Inside the barn, he worked by the single lantern, replacing the broken spar with a thicker piece of oak he had traded for. He added small flaps at the wing edges, testing their movement with string. Each night he wrote what he had learned, how weight shifted forward, how fabric needed to be taut but not tight, how a sudden crosswind demanded a lower launch angle. The notes filled half a notebook he kept hidden under a loose floorboard. On the 5th attempt, the glider held together long enough to cross the entire meadow. Elias ran behind it, watching the tail stay level. For 3 full seconds it rode the air as if it belonged there. Then a loose knot at the left wing gave way. The fabric billowed and the machine dropped, skidding to a stop in the tall grass. Elias reached it before the boys watching from the fence could call out. He knelt and felt along the wing. The knot had been tied in haste the night before. He untied the rest of the cords methodically, carried the glider back, and spent the rest of the evening retying every joint with double loops. By the end of the week, the barn floor held a growing line of failed frames. Elias stood among them one evening, lantern raised, and walked slowly from one wreck to the next. He touched each broken strut and torn fabric, naming the cause aloud in a low voice. Too much forward weight, fabric too loose, launch too steep. The words settled the frustration in his chest. Outside, the meadow lay quiet under moonlight. He returned to the workbench, laid fresh wood across it, and began cutting the next frame. The spark had not dimmed. It had only settled deeper, steady as the pulse in his wrists while he measured and marked. Elias set the last measurement on the fresh frame and straightened his back. Dawn crept over the meadow, turning the dew to silver. He had worked through the night, but the questions still circled. The failed launch had taught him limits, yet limits alone would not carry a machine into the air. He needed better knowledge, the kind that lived in books and workshops rather than in one man's guesses. With a quiet decision, he wrapped the half-finished frame in oilcloth, shouldered his small pack, and turned toward the road that led to the city. The walk took 2 days. Elias moved at a steady pace, stopping only when the sun climbed too high or the light failed. Along the way he watched the birds, noting how they adjusted their wings to the wind without effort. He tried to copy the motion with his arms and felt foolish, yet the observation stayed with him. By the second afternoon, the city walls rose ahead, grey stone against the haze of chimney smoke. The streets inside were narrower than he remembered, crowded with carts and voices that rose and fell like water over stones. He found the first mentor through a chance question at a market stall. An older man named Harlan sat behind a table of brass instruments, mending a broken sextant. Harlan listened to Elias describe the meadow tests without laughing. Instead, he invited him into a cramped back room lined with charts of curves and arrows. There, over 2 evenings, Harlan explained how air moving faster over a curved surface created lift. He drew simple diagrams on scrap paper and made Elias hold a thin strip of wood at different angles while a small fan turned. The lesson was plain: the wing must meet the wind at the right angle, or the whole craft would pitch or stall. Elias left each night with pages of notes folded inside his coat. The second mentor appeared the next morning when Elias asked the bookseller for texts on fabric strength. The woman behind the counter, Marta, studied his calloused hands and sent him to a narrow workshop 2 streets away. Marta worked with lightweight woods and treated linen. She showed him how to select straight-grained spruce instead of the heavier oak he had been using, and how to stretch the fabric so it remained taut without tearing under sudden gusts. Together they tested small samples in a draft from an open window, listening for the soft whistle that warned of coming failure. Marta offered a bundle of pre-cut spars and a length of the treated cloth, refusing payment beyond a promise that Elias would return with results. Word of the young man's questions spread quickly among the small circle of tinkerers who gathered in the city's lower quarter. A cartwright named Theo joined them on the 3rd evening, bringing a set of bronze fittings that could replace Elias's rope lashings. The 3 mentors sat around a scarred table while Elias described the last launch. They listened without interrupting, then offered small corrections one by one. Harlan spoke of balance and the need for a movable tail surface. Marta stressed the importance of keeping total weight under a certain limit she marked on a scrap of wood. Theo suggested a simple release hook that would let the craft leave the ground cleanly rather than fighting the ramp. None of them claimed the answers were complete, yet each piece fit into the others like parts of a single puzzle. By the end of the week, Elias had a new frame partly assembled in Harlan's back room. The spruce spars felt almost weightless compared with his earlier attempts. The fabric lay smooth under Marta's careful stitching. Theo's fittings clicked into place without binding. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional request for another measurement or a second opinion on an angle. When the basic shape stood finished, they carried it into the courtyard at dusk and watched how the evening breeze moved across the surface. The wing lifted slightly on its supports, and Elias felt the same steady pulse he had known at his own workbench, only now shared. On the morning he prepared to leave, the 3 mentors added a final bundle to his pack: a small notebook of calculated angles, a spare length of the treated linen, and a letter of introduction to a farmer whose field lay beyond the next ridge. They asked no promises in return. Harlan simply clapped Elias on the shoulder and said the work would continue whether the first flight succeeded or not. Elias nodded, thanked them once, and stepped back onto the road with the new frame balanced across his shoulders. The city gates closed behind him, yet the weight of the craft already felt different, lighter, as though the air itself had begun to cooperate. Elias walked the final stretch of road with the frame balanced across his shoulders, the city gates already a distant memory behind him. The air felt thinner and sharper now, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as his workshop came into view at the base of the low hills. He set the frame down inside the open doorway and brushed the dust from its edges, already picturing how the new braces would lock into the wings he had shaped the week before. For an hour he worked steadily, the hammer tapping a quiet rhythm while he fitted the struts and checked the tension on each joint. The latest model rested on its sawhorses like a sleeping bird, canvas stretched taut and oiled to a dull sheen. Elias paused only to wipe sweat from his brow and sip from the tin cup on the bench. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade. though the sky still held no warning of what would come. A low rumble rolled across the hills first, so distant he mistook it for a cart on the far road. Then the wind rose in one sudden gust that slammed the workshop door against the wall. Elias turned in time to see the first heavy drops strike the roof. Within moments, the rain thickened into sheets that hammered the shingles and streamed through every gap in the old timbers. He hurried to secure the model, tying ropes around the frame, but the wind tore at the canvas with claws of cold air. Lightning cracked overhead and the workshop shuddered. A section of roof gave way with a splintering tear, sending water pouring directly onto the wings. Elias shouted against the roar, though no one could hear him, and tried to drag the craft toward the driest corner. The wind caught the half-finished tail and flipped it sideways, smashing one wing against the workbench. Wood splintered, fabric ripped free and flapped like a wounded flag. Another bolt struck nearby, its flash turning the interior white for an instant before darkness swallowed everything again. He fought the storm for what felt like hours, slipping on the mud that now covered the floor, until the wind finally eased and the rain settled into a steady, merciless downpour. When he could stand upright without being shoved, Elias lit the single lantern that had survived. Its weak glow revealed the ruin. The new frame lay twisted and broken, struts snapped like kindling. The wings were shredded, the canvas hanging in sodden rags. Tools were scattered across the soaked boards, some already rusting from the flood that still trickled through the collapsed roof. The workshop itself leaned at a dangerous angle, one wall half caved in where a tree limb had punched through. Elias sank onto an overturned crate, water dripping from his hair and sleeves. The model he had carried so carefully from the city, the one that had felt lighter with every step, was now nothing more than wreckage. He reached out and touched a splintered spar, feeling the sharp edge bite his palm. For a long while he sat without moving, the only sound the steady drip of water from the rafters and the distant thunder fading into the hills. Doubt pressed in like the damp air. He thought of the long nights already spent shaping each piece, of the money he had borrowed to buy the new frame, and of the quiet expectation in Harlan's eyes when the older man had clapped his shoulder. The pressure returned heavier than before, a weight that settled across his chest and made each breath feel earned. Perhaps the dream had always been too fragile for storms like this one. Perhaps every attempt would end the same way, with broken wood and torn cloth and the bitter taste of failure on his tongue. He stood slowly, boots squelching in the mud, and walked the length of the ruined bench. A single undamaged spar lay half buried beneath the collapsed roof. Elias pulled it free, wiped the grit from its surface, and set it on the least damaged sawhorse. The motion felt small and stubborn at the same time. Outside, the clouds began to thin, revealing a narrow band of bruised sky. He gathered what tools he could find that still worked, laid them beside the spar, and began to measure the length by the faint lantern light. The first cut would be quiet, almost careful, but it would be the start. Elias pressed the saw against the wood and drew it back slowly. The blade bit in with a soft rasp that barely disturbed the night air. His friends had arrived one by one, slipping through the side door like shadows drawn to the same lantern. Mara carried the spare wire they needed for the rudder lines. Tom brought the last of the canvas patches. They worked without speaking at first, each taking up a task as if they had rehearsed it in daylight for weeks. The spar was shorter now, trimmed to fit the new frame they had built from scavenged pine. Elias measured twice more before he let the saw finish its work. The cut edge was clean enough. He ran his thumb along it and nodded once. Mara handed him the wire without being asked. Together they threaded it through the eyelets on the tail assembly, pulling each loop tight so the fabric would hold under wind pressure. Outside, the clouds kept thinning, and a sliver of moon finally showed itself above the tree line. They moved the whole frame toward the wide barn doors. The wheels on the undercarriage squeaked once, then settled into a smoother roll. Tom braced the nose while Mara checked the wing struts. Elias crouched beside the small engine they had rebuilt from parts taken off an old tractor. He turned the crank carefully, listening for the catch of the valves. It turned over twice without complaint, but on the third try it stuck. He eased the pressure, waited, and tried again. The mechanism gave a dry click and nothing more. Mara wiped her hands on a rag and knelt next to him, She pointed to the fuel line where a small crack showed in the rubber. They had sealed it earlier with tape, but the tape had pulled loose during the move. Elias cut a fresh strip from the roll and wound it around the joint twice, pressing hard so the edges overlapped. Tom stood watch at the door, listening for any sound from the road. The night stayed quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. They pushed the machine the last few yards into the open field behind the barn. The grass was tall and damp, muffling the wheels. Elias climbed into the seat and checked the control stick. It moved freely now that the new cables were in place. Mara held the wingtip steady while Tom spun the propeller through several turns to prime the cylinders. On the signal, they all froze and listened again. Nothing stirred beyond the fence line. Elias pulled the starter lever. The engine coughed once, caught, and settled into a low, uneven idle. He adjusted the throttle a fraction and felt the frame vibrate beneath him. The propeller blurred into a pale circle under the moonlight. He eased the machine forward, testing the ground roll. The tail lifted slightly as speed built. Then a sharp metallic ping sounded from the engine compartment. The idle faltered, and the whole craft shuddered to a stop. Tom ran forward and lifted the cowling. A small spring had snapped free from the carburetor linkage. Elias climbed down, and they bent over the exposed parts together. Mara held the lantern closer while they searched the grass for the missing piece. They found it near the left wheel, bent but still usable. Elias straightened it with pliers and reattached it, testing the movement with his finger. The linkage worked again, yet the engine refused to catch on the next try. They waited through 2 more attempts before the cylinders fired once more. The sound was thinner now, missing some of its earlier strength. Elias climbed back into the seat anyway. He advanced the throttle farther than before. The machine rolled faster across the uneven ground, bumping over hidden ruts. The left wing dipped when a wheel hit a soft patch. Mara and Tom ran alongside, steadying the fabric until the craft leveled again. At the far end of the field, the engine gave a final cough and died. The propeller slowed to a stop. Elias set the brake and stepped out. He walked around the nose and checked the spark plug leads one by one. 2 of them had loosened during the run. He tightened them with his fingers until they seated properly. The others watched without comment. They knew the repairs would hold for one more short test at best. They turned the machine around by hand and pointed it back toward the barn. The moon had climbed higher, washing the grass in silver. Elias rested one hand on the wing strut and felt the wood still warm from the engine heat. Mara coiled the extra wire and slipped it into her pocket. Tom wiped grease from his palms onto the same rag she had used earlier. No one suggested another run that night. They simply began the slow walk back, pushing the craft through the tall grass toward the waiting doors. The first real flight would have to wait for another midnight when the parts held longer. The hangar doors creaked shut behind them, sealing the craft in shadow. Mara's hands lingered on the latch for a moment longer than necessary, as if the metal could hold the memory of their almost success. Tom muttered something about checking the fuel lines again in daylight, but his voice lacked conviction. They left the machine where it stood, nose tilted slightly toward the high windows, and walked out into the cooling night without another word. Dawn brought a different kind of quiet. Elias woke before the others and returned alone to the hangar. Sunlight slanted across the wings, revealing every patch and weld they had rushed through the week before. He ran his palm along the leading edge, feeling the faint vibration that still lived in the frame, even at rest. The engine block had cooled, yet when he touched it, he imagined the heat returning, the cylinders firing in perfect sequence, the propeller biting air instead of empty space. He allowed himself one slow breath. Tonight they would not stop at taxiing. Mara arrived at dusk with a thermos of strong coffee and a fresh coil of wire. Tom followed, carrying the toolbox they had emptied and refilled 3 times already. No speeches passed between them. They simply set to work under the single bulb that swung from its chain, tightening bolts that did not need tightening and double-checking gauges that already read true. Elias climbed into the cockpit and tested the stick. The controls answered with a crispness they had never shown before. When the last strap was secured and the final spark plug inspected, the 3 of them stood back and looked at the machine as though seeing it for the first time. Midnight arrived with a thin wind that rattled the hangar vents. They rolled the craft outside once more, this time without speaking of failure. Elias settled into the seat. Mara stood at the wingtip with the starter rope. Tom positioned himself by the tail, ready to steady the frame. The engine turned over on the third pull, coughing once before settling into a steady roar that vibrated through Elias's ribs. He advanced the throttle in careful increments. The propeller blurred. Grass flattened beneath the wheels. The craft rolled forward, gathering speed, until the tail lifted and the world narrowed to the strip of cleared field ahead. Then the wheels left the ground. The jolt was smaller than Elias expected, almost gentle, as if the machine had simply decided to stop pretending it belonged on Earth. Wind rushed past the open cockpit, carrying the scent of turned soil and distant rain. Below him, the hangar shrank to a dark rectangle, then to a toy, then vanished into the larger darkness of fields and roads. He eased the stick forward a fraction and felt the craft respond, climbing steadily. The engine note changed, deepening as it worked against thinner air. For the first time since the project began, there was no rattle, no warning cough, only the clean, continuous pull of thrust and lift. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon at first, tracking the faint line where land met sky. Memories arrived uninvited. He saw the workshop benches buried under sketches, the nights when Mara had soldered connections by candlelight because the power had failed again, the morning Tom had arrived with a salvaged magneto and refused to explain where he found it. He remembered the first taxi test that ended in a broken wheel, the second that ended in laughter when the craft refused to lift at all. Each setback had narrowed their choices until only this single path remained. Now the path had opened into empty space. He banked gently left and felt the wing bite the turn. The moon had risen, silvering the river that wound beneath them. Lights from the nearest town flickered like scattered embers. Up here, the future felt less like a promise and more like a landscape already forming. Elias pictured other machines following this one, built by hands he would never meet, carrying people who had never heard his name. The thought did not shrink him, it steadied him. The machine was no longer only his, it had become a beginning that others could continue long after the engine had been replaced and the wings repainted. A subtle shift in the wind reminded him of fuel and time. He leveled the wings, aligned the nose with the distant hangar lights Tom had left burning, and began the descent. The craft settled back onto the grass with a soft rumble, rolling to a stop exactly where they had started. Elias killed the engine. Silence rushed in, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Mara reached the cockpit first. She did not ask if he had felt the lift. The answer was written in the set of his shoulders. Tom simply nodded once, the way he did when a repair held. Elias climbed out and stood with them, the three of them looking at the machine as though it might speak. It did not. It simply waited, wings still trembling slightly from the flight, ready for whatever midnight came next.